First of all, thank you for coming.
Absolute pleasure, Louise. Nice to sit here in person together.
It's the first time, so you guys have to bear with me because normally I have the Zoom and I'm talking to the screen, so I'm looking at my screen. But really delighted that you could come and talk about your fantastic book. I'm flagging it here. Those of you who don't know, am I doing it? Yes.
Yeah, that one.
Is that camera. We have bought 2 extra copies that I'm hoping Tony will sign for 2 of you, and we will send it off. If you're still here at about 5:45, we'll do all that, and we'll. It's been a joy to read, actually.
Thank you. You've read it.
I have twice. That's my habit. I kind of read quite quickly, and then I go back and I put in.
Okay, put your notes in. Yeah.
Not notes, questions. Thinking, oh, why is he saying that?
Excellent.
But I should do a proper intro.
Yeah.
Celebrated campaigner. Friends of the Earth.
Yes.
Now
many years.
England.
Yes.
But also started life as an ornithologist.
Yes.
So you love birds?
Birds was my thing, and fish and reptiles and trees and geology, and a very wide range of interests as a naturalist, which took me into conservation, which then took me into being a scientist, but then into campaigning, and then into various other things, including writing, and now being a public servant, leading the British government's nature agency in England, looking after the natural environment on behalf of the country. So that's what I now do, amongst a few other bits and pieces, including a bit of time still for writing, which is good.
Which we're all grateful for.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
And I guess, so do you see your life in chapters?
Actually, yeah, probably. I suppose what's happened is that it tends to be in 5 or 6 year chunks that things have gone along, and just purely by accident. So being a scientist working in conservation organizations, and then 3 separate roles at Friends of the Earth. So 6 years on biodiversity and rainforests, then 6 years being the campaigns director, and then 6 years being the director and the vice chair of Friends of the Earth International. And then actually a slightly longer period working with the Prince of Wales, now King Charles. We wrote some things together as well during the course of that, including his book Harmony. And then a period at WWF, and now just completed 6 years at Natural England. But yesterday it was announced that I will serve a further 2 years, having done 2 terms of 3, which is normally what you would do, but they've asked me to stay for a bit. And considering...
And you said yes?
I said yes, because the policy world is changing. There's a new government. And so I thought it would be good to have a bit of continuity as they deliver their manifesto. So that's what I'm doing. I'm staying for 2 more years at Natural England, which I'm delighted about. There's lots to do. There always is, of course.
Well, I think we are delighted.
Well, thank you.
Because knowing that you're looking at that, and especially here, I guess. So I moderated a session earlier today, sort of a little session around what are people seeing in nature in the UK.
Oh, lovely.
And one of the things that came out, not the major thing, was that it felt like there isn't a systemic approach across government to nature.
No.
So having Natural England.
Yes, I think England's not alone. I think this is a challenge that most countries face, is how you can embed the ecological issues into the wider fabric of how countries work. Health policy, transport policy, agriculture, obviously a huge one.
Yes.
How we supply water, how we look at the supply of clean energy. All of these things need to be blended into the ecological ambition, otherwise they won't work. I mean, it will never work as a silo. So that's a big part of our job at Natural England, is to be able to mainstream this across all of those different arms of government. And actually, one of the things that gives me a little bit of encouragement and hope at the moment is that a tight spending review is going to require everybody in government to be thinking much more creatively and innovatively.
Work together rather than
working together to get more out of our budgets than we do in silos by combining our efforts. So there could be a bit of a silver lining in some of the difficulties that we're facing as a country at the moment in terms of the public spending squeeze. So we'll be looking at that as an opportunity, as well as something which is going to be quite challenging.
It's got to be an opportunity.
Yes,
right?
I think so. Yeah.
And I want to come back to some of that, and also the jump that you've made from campaigner to public servant, I guess.
Yeah.
Policy
maker. Yes. Yeah. So people asked me this when I went to work at Natural, and they said, how can you do that? You used to be director of Friends of the Earth. How can you work for the government? To which I thought, what a stupid question. Because actually, these are all different faces of the same issue. And, you know, if the government isn't doing it right, then it's not going to work. If the NGOs aren't effective, it's not going to work. If the scientists aren't clever about their research, it's not going to work. If there isn't a buy-in from the private sector, it's not going to work. And so I just feel very privileged to have seen these issues from all of these different perspectives, including as a writer, and to be able to contribute from these multiple pronged approaches, because all of it is necessary if we're going to make the transition. So it just seemed like to me, like the wrong question, because it's just another way of doing the same thing.
And another way of, I guess, looking at a system that is interconnected.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, so that's right. So having those experiences that preceded my time at Natural England, I think it's been very valuable in being able to inform the work that we're doing.
And can you, obviously, 2 more years of really, really important work.
Yes.
Have you still got an eye on what happened in the next chunk or not yet?
No, I mean, I think my entire kind of contribution, it's been very organic in terms of what happens next. So maybe in 18 months' time, I'll start to reflect on what's going to follow. Actually, before it was announced that I was staying, I was beginning to think about that, but I didn't actually reach any conclusions. So it's just as well they've asked me to stay for a bit.
You've got something to do.
Yes,
excellent.
Right, exactly.
Oh, and just with the book, let's just talk a little bit about, so you wrote Harmony, which, as I was saying to you, I have on my bookshelf at home, the Prince of Wales at the time. Why this one? I know that you say you sat next to Swedish minister.
Yes.
And it was her answer to your question.
Simple question. I asked a former Swedish environment minister, why is Sweden able to do so much more on all these issues, natural environment protection, cleaning up vehicle engines, shift to renewable energy, looking after big landscapes for nature? And she said to me, it's very straightforward. It's because we're so much more equal than you are. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, because I thought the answer would be, it's because we go swimming in lakes, we go hiking at the weekend, we're all very green because we're connected. It wasn't that. It was because the society that she worked in as a politician was equal. That was her answer. And so this struck a chord with me at the time, because having spent years at Friends of the Earth, especially with Friends of the Earth International, the social justice issues were always front and center for our Latin American and Asian and African groups. And whereas in Europe, we tended always to focus much more on policy and technology and green consumerism, all these kinds of things, which are fine. And that was the European context. But there was always, my eyes were being opened by the experiences of colleagues working in the tropical developing southern countries. And so I'd kind of had it located in my mind. And then, you know, that conversation sparked a thought in my thinking about, well, you know, maybe this just needs to be explored a bit more in terms of all of these different dimensions of how social issues collide with environmental issues. Because what we had been doing for a long time before that particular moment was focusing on questions of environmental justice. So the poor get hit hardest by pollution, by climate change impacts, and also access to green space tends to be lower if you're from more deprived communities. But that conversation with the Swedish environment minister, it suggested actually a much more profound set of issues, which I explore in the book, which I link to, for example, the extent to which it's much harder in unequal societies to actually get environmental policies enacted, because it's always seen as a threat to the poor people. Cost of living crisis, in particular, we're seeing it now. This is a strong pushback on sustainable agriculture, going to make food more expensive. Renewables, green tariffs are going to make energy more expensive. Cleaning up the rivers, that's going to require more investment in water. That's going to push up bills for people. Those things, of course, are much more potent in unequal societies compared to more equal ones, hence the comment from the Swedish environment minister. And so then you start to think, actually, this is really quite a systemic thing, because then you start to think through, okay, well, what's the remedy to this inequality? And of course, the remedy is economic growth. And then when you start to interrogate that, you realize that much of the economic growth is going to the already rich people, thereby driving more demand for resources and more inequality, thereby making the position even more difficult, thereby raising big questions about how we pursue economic development. as a means to reduce inequality. So all of these things, they kind of run together. And then I thought maybe there's a book in it. And so that hence just yes.
And so you all through the book, it's really interesting. If you haven't read it, there are interviews, light interviews with very different types of people. How did you go about that process?
Yeah. So one thing about this set of subjects is the density of the literature. And a lot of it is really quite technical, and it requires a lot of kind of reading to get your head around it. And one shortcut through that is to speak to the people, of course, who wrote the literature and who are the real experts. And so I interviewed some of them, and, the invitation was, well, if you're sitting talking to a friend, how would you describe this kind of question and these kinds of issues? And so from that, you get a lot of wisdom distilled, which means that the reader of this doesn't have to go to the technical literature to understand some of these really big questions about consumerism, security, historical inequality, the role of economic kind of policy choices and how they pan out. And so, natural kind of language that you'd have with a friend rather than a peer-reviewed journal was what I was aiming for. In terms of bringing those thoughts out.
Was there anyone who you wanted to interview you couldn't get to?
Actually, no, everyone was very generous with their time. There were a few people I wrote to, probably they didn't get the email. I don't think anyone said they didn't want to be. So, I felt very content with the range of voices that were able to be brought in. And just before we started, Louise, you and I were just talking about previous Anthropy and a chance conversation I had here with General Richard Nugey from the British Army, which I included a conversation with him in the book. So that was a very organic kind of unexpected conversation that led to some really important insight being included here. And that one was about work that he did as a serving officer with the British Army in Afghanistan, discovering that the Taliban was deriving quite a lot of its strength from the impacts of climate change, which was like a really kind of interesting way of seeing how the unequal impacts of climate change, in that case hitting very poor farmers in the Hindu Kush, led to their livelihoods collapsing, then making them very attractive recruits for the Taliban. And so that's where they got much of their strength from, was these farmers' crops failing. Very poor people suffering from the pollution coming historically from Western countries for the most part. And then the thing about that, of course, is that it's a boomerang effect, because you think, oh, climate change is too expensive to sort out. Well, how much did the Afghanistan war cost us? Not only in money, but also people. Terrible cost, but never, in most people's minds, linked to climate change.
Do they link that? No, I spoke to Richard actually a couple of weeks ago, and he said he's now working for the Jordanian government, pinpointing layers of risk from climate, societal, that's in order that they might address some of those issues before they become issues and destabilize the government. So he's basically saying climate change is one thing, but what we will see if we don't address it
is political risk.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, in that part of the world, of course, they've already seen some of this with the Syrian civil war, which many, again, I review the literature that looked at the origins of that, which includes an unprecedented drought, which led to massive rural to urban migration, which then led to political tensions, which then led to demonstrations, which then led to a crackdown, which then led to violence, which then led to a civil war, but then also led to mass migration, which led to Brexit. And so there's a cascade of effects as a result of the impacts of climate hitting poor and vulnerable people. And so it goes on. And so, you see not only a social justice issue, you see a massive risk issue, which is what General Nugey sounds like he's working with now with the Jordanian government.
Which is, I think, super interesting, right?
It is.
Because even in somewhere like Spain, we saw in Valencia when the King of Spain went after the floods, people were throwing things at him and blaming him. And this idea that you blame government because they haven't, maybe rightly so, because they haven't sorted out those risks.
And actually, so the political ramifications are really quite profound. And actually give you the opposite kind of effect than you might expect sometimes. So in the United States, massive dissatisfaction with the government as a result of its failure to deal with the aftermath of hurricanes and everything else. And then those voters dissatisfied, they elect President Trump, which is kind of the opposite of what you might expect to be the conclusion.
But it's the need for change.
Exactly, that's right.
I can see one of the questions that has just come in is about books. So we're changing it from Charlie Ross. Is Mike Berners-Lee gets his a Climate of Truth published tomorrow. Do you read each other's books?
Actually, he and I will be sharing a platform at the Cambridge Literary Festival in April. And so I'll be looking at that before we go there. So for sure. And I expect to be looking at Just Earth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another question is, what is it about this time of year? Is that the publisher saying it's a good time to publish?
It was not going to say random. It just kind of it's just when the book got finished and then the editing got done and then when it I don't know if there's a time of year. I don't think so.
No, unless you're going for Christmas bestseller.
Yeah, exactly. But we weren't looking to do that. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up and you talk about, and I'm going to read it off my notes, sort of balance this idea that we can balance GDP growth and we have to balance ecological solutions with that. And that's a complete fallacy.
Yeah.
That we need to create well-being now and repair for the future.
Yeah.
So is that degrowth? How do you get challenged on this? Because we're having lots of debates about this. And how far do you?
Well, I'll tell you my answer to that. So, and I devote a chapter in this book and then various other points touch on the subject. Because, as I said before, the economic growth, it's pursued as the remedy to poverty, but actually it drives more inequality and more consumption of resources. Having said that, economic growth has been a very powerful force for good in the world that's created, these comfortable living conditions and a level of security on food and everything else. And so we mustn't dismiss that. But evidently, the downsides need to be managed. And so my thought in here is about what are we measuring as growth? And so, we're measuring GDP when in fact, might we wish to measure equality, environmental impact, social cohesion, happiness, crime, health, longevity, levels of education, because all of those things we can measure, the state of nature, and we want all of them to be growing. Whereas at the moment, what we're doing is growing GDP and a lot of those other things are declining. And so I have a little bit of conversation in here about a thing called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which was proposed years ago, which does bring together this whole set of different metrics and combines them in one metric. And the Genuine Progress Indicator, yes, we do want growth in that, but it's not growing one thing, it's growing multiple things. And the way I think about that is to describe the Genuine Progress Indicator as a vehicle for achieving well-being for 8-10 billion people on a living planet. I mean, that is the goal, presumably, that we now need to pursue, rather than simply assuming that we grow GDP and everything else follows, because we know it doesn't.
Yeah, and we've seen that. And I guess it was when GDP was invented, almost.
It was invented at a different age.
Exactly.
Nobody heard about climate change.
They knew that it's not going to measure what's really important.
Well, no, exactly. So Kuznets, who was the originator of the idea, he said, don't use this as an overall measure of progress. I mean, that was his advice, and history reveals that it wasn't listened to.
We've done it. And actually, on that note, there's some really interesting work by Dark Matter Labs on what they're calling life enabling economics, where they've looked at indicators very specifically on, and one of them is young people having hope and making plans.
Yeah, there we are.
Which is actually an indicator of how a society
of
and
well-being.
How the economy works.
People can see a bright future. Exactly that. And at the moment, I think probably you did a poll of youngsters. They probably think it doesn't look too great at the moment. No, and yet growth may be going up. So thereby proving that point. Yeah.
And so, so you talked about systems change shifts, and I see Brian who's from Ireland, I happen to know, he's saying, should systems thinking and its application in society be a core part of all educational curricula? Why do we, at least for him, wait until master's level to study that in detail? That's really interesting.
It is, isn't it?
It came up today, in fact, Brian, in this nature session I was in, which was, why are we not teaching nature and systems thinking? What do you think of this?
Well, that's actually a proposal I've not seen before, but it makes total sense, doesn't it? Because, the way things go is really a reflection of how we think, and how we think is in silos. Actually, I remember from Harmony, a conversation that led to some thoughts that were included in that book about our education system being geared to knowing more and more about less and less. Which is quite an interesting thought, isn't it? Because you think you kind of go through your school exams and you're already kind of going down, I'm going to be a scientist or I'm going to be a biologist. And then you go off and do your master's and your degree, and then you do a PhD, and then, you know, you become the world expert in one gene, in one species of mosquito, as a means of understanding, you know, a pathway maybe to a malaria cure. And at that point, you are so specialist that you are the world expert on that little subject. But you may not know anything about soil erosion or global inequality or the need to change economic thinking. And so the brightest minds are channeled into these very specific places, which may not be the best thing that we need at the moment, because we need breadth as well as specialism.
Well, and somehow not siloing life off from education.
Exactly.
That you should, you know, you should be learning
a rounded approach.
You know, I don't know about you, but I remember my grandmother teaching me bird names and names of plants. It wasn't something I learned at school until later. But that was you know, you get that
as a result of her having had that learning when she was younger. So that idea of systems thinking being something we train, I think it's critical. You know, you look at the government, and it's the same in other organizations. You know, they tend to be organized in these silos, you know, health, transport, education, environment, when in fact, you know, it's the horizontal lines that cut across the silos, which is where we need to be effective. And people don't think like that.
No. Though hopefully more and more, you know, there are more and more, I guess, interdisciplinary courses coming, because it's quite risky to put your life and your career in this age of uncertainty. If you choose to be an expert.
But expertise is great and it's fine.
Oh yes.
But if you had systems expertise to be able to deploy your specialism, then you get different outcomes, I think.
There you go. That's in support, Brian.
Yeah, we like that idea.
Excellent. And where one of the, when you were talking about the brightest minds, you know, being really specialist, one of my brain slightly went to, and there's also a lot of bright people who are going into creating apps to make life easier for people coming out of Silicon Valley, or selling ads on Google or whatever. How do you see, I'm going to say tech and green tech in
so you know, well, if you
it's
look,
in the book.
It's a little bit in here, but if you look at the whole sustainability field, I mean, there's an explosion of attention going into AI and what the applications of that could be. And that's great. And, you know, it could help us. And actually at Natural England, we're looking at ways in which we can use artificial intelligence for doing survey work. And in fact, we had a piece on the news the other day of using drones with AI to do seal counts along the Norfolk coast. And so this would take weeks normally for an ecologist traipsing up and down in the rain. We do a couple of flyovers with the drone at high altitude, don't disturb the seals. And then it goes off and it tells us how many are there. And it can do it, you know, as often as we like, very quickly. And so that's good, that's valuable. That then gives us ecological trend data, which can then tell us about how we might want to manage the conservation programs and everything else. That's great. However, at the same time, this same technology is going to be deployed to get us to buy loads more crap that we don't need. And so it's like many technological kind of innovations. It's a tool, and you can use the tool to make something beautiful, or you can use it to destroy things. And that tool is now in the hands, obviously, of multinationals with particular commercial objectives. And so then I guess the question comes back to, what is the philosophy of those organizations? Are they going to pursue sustainability, or are they going to pursue business as usual with that AI? And, you know, that's a question that will continue to be asked, of course. And, you know, at Volans, you do all this work to help them see the light on that. But it's very powerful. I fear that probably what will happen to begin with, at least, is that these new cutting edge artificial intelligence technologies, they will be used to generate and concentrate wealth. I think probably they will exacerbate the trend that's already in play, because the people who own this are also already the very wealthy organizations and people, and they will use it to draw in more wealth to their organizations and the people who own them. And so, you know, and also jobs will be lost, of course, in the process.
Many jobs.
Some will be created, but a great many will be lost. And, you know, is it another hollowing out of the middle of society's professional jobs like accountancy? Is that now something where you log the data, lawyers, all this kind of thing? Consultants, environmentalists, hopefully can carry on for a bit longer yet.
But it is really interesting.
But it has profound implications. And, you know, thinking about the themes in Just Earth, you know, if it exacerbates inequalities, it's going to create, you know, a further problematic social context for solving environmental problems.
So let's talk a little bit more about, and do you want to take a breath?
No, we're all good.
You're good.
Some water there if needed.
The of the book, and we've got company, and equality, because how do you measure equality? And you go into a couple of
bit of that.
rules.
Yeah.
Do you think is that a challenge that people won't agree on?
It's like all the kind of metrics that try to encapsulate complicated situations, turning it into a single number. And so I touch a little bit on the Gini coefficient, which is used to do this. There's another thing called the Palmer ratio. But both of those show, and the details you can argue about, but the broad historical trend over the last 40 years is to see this widening of inequality to the point today where it's become extreme. And so some of the academics I talk to, they compare our current circumstances with that prevailing around the time just before the First World War, when the world was extremely unequal. Certainly in the United States and in the UK, you had a very high proportion of national wealth owned by a tiny number of people. And we've just kind of gone back there over this period since about 1979. This is when the free market neoliberal revolution was getting going, and small government, big role for the private sector and everything else. And it's been spectacularly successful in generating huge wealth. Trouble is, it's been concentrated amongst a small number of people. And so, and then considering that backdrop against these environmental issues, this is what the book then examines, is how that inequality plays into these ecological challenges. And as we've said, a series of barriers then come, which make it very hard to sort out the environmental issues. Yeah.
I've lost my thread.
Got plenty of thread going so far.
Different threads. I think so. One of the accusations, I guess, against the sustainability movement over the last at least 6 months, if not longer, there's been this interesting backlash and a lot of reflection on, well, had it just become elitist anyway? And had we forgotten?
Well, yes, I think it's the answer, and to an extent, let's say. So if you look at the narrative on climate in many Western countries, we've got to get away from fossil fuels. And it's not wrong. It's scientifically grounded. But then if you look at Donald Trump's first campaign in 2016, he was going out with a climate denial message, and he was targeting that particularly to those communities who felt very threatened by the climate story. So the West Virginia coal miners, the auto workers in Detroit, the Pennsylvania steel workers, all of whom could see their jobs evaporating as a result of the decarbonisation process. And so what we had inadvertently created was a very rich, fertile body of scepticism, because those people hadn't been part of the journey. And so one of the chapters in here is called Just Transition, which is what's needed to be able to deal with that. So is there a pathway between these jobs and new jobs, between the pride you have in that industry and the pride you're going to have in a future industry, between the community cohesion you feel now and the community cohesion you're going to have in the future? Or are you going to be chucked out of a job with no livelihood and your community is going to fall apart? And so I'll vote for Donald Trump because he says it's not true. And you can perfectly understand the psychology of that. And so, therefore, can you say that the environmentalists were elitist? Well, in that sense, you probably could say that they at least were not connected with the people who needed most convincing, which are the people whose jobs are going to, reassuring, but having some policy that actually is a bridge between the here and now and the future low carbon society. And that is played back all the time now. Multiple sectors, not just on fossil energy, also agriculture. And there's people, the farmers now, they can't make a living because of the market conditions they're trading in. People can't afford to buy it either. And yet between the farmers and the consumers, there's fortunes being accumulated by some of the global commodity companies and some of the supermarket organizations. And so these are structural inequalities that are blocking progress. And we need to pay attention to them, and the pathways to fixing them are not straightforward. But if we don't have that as part of the transition that we're seeking to achieve, it's going to be very difficult or impossible to do it.
To actually do it.
Politically impossible.
And do you think, so obviously there's no silver bullet, but policy is going to be incredibly important. How important is the actions of businesses going to be, do you think, in
Critical,
that?
of course.
In
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
and how would you, I know there are lots of business people on this call, so
Yeah.
I'm kind of wanting to
Yeah.
say, well, what is the policy? How do they start
Yeah.
leaning into this?
So, well, I mean, when it comes to policy, you know, the people who can help shape good policy include the businesses. You know, they very often sit on the sidelines and they're receiving, you know, government kind of choices, and sometimes they complain about it, sometimes they're okay with it. But I think, you know, if there are businesses who recognize this failing social context on the environmental side, you know, working with government to be able to fix that is going to be an important part of what happens. And, you know, I don't have space in the book to go into a great deal of detail on this, but, you know, the idea of purpose-driven companies, of course, is the obvious place to go. So is your purpose purely to generate returns for shareholders and owners of the companies, or are you embracing a social and ecological purpose? And if you're doing that, then, you know, what does that mean for your strategy?
And exactly, and how do you not trade one off against the other?
Exactly, so integrating these things.
And in a sense, at least what I'm seeing is that because it is true and climate is happening and is affecting us, that risk is growing for businesses to ignore it.
Yeah, of course,
and so there's more and more likelihood that you know it's coming, and unless you lean into
it's going to play back into the world of business in the end, and the risks associated with that for all sectors are absolutely huge. And so how do you anticipate that? I mean, this then requires leadership from businesses who can look slightly ahead and to be anticipating what plausibly is coming, and to be able to build business strategies to deal with that, and working in partnership with government as part of that response. And, you know, trouble is, historically, maybe less so now, I hope less so now, quite a lot of companies, they're looking at quarterly, half-yearly returns, and they still are. And so that doesn't help, because these things, they're not going to be solved in a quarter, but the consequences will be devastating when they occur.
And that's where, if the risk is growing, then there is a opportunity to look at that slightly longer term in a different way. Well, that's it. I'm just saying, Kate is saying, I'm really curious about the concept of just transition and the lens we need to apply, whether it's justice within a country or community, or whether we must think more broadly across countries. Put simply, is justice for an oil and gas worker in the US more important than justice for people in the global south who are facing life or death? Can we realistically ensure justice for both?
So one thing I conclude, that's a very good question. So one thing I conclude based upon years of engagement with all of this, it is that the real change is going to come inside individual countries. And, you know, the global accords and the COPs and the treaties and the UN and everything else, this is vital, but it's not where we make real progress. You know, that's where we get kind of consensus, hopefully being, you know, hammered out. But in terms of things that are going to create a real difference, this is mostly going to be done within the context of the nation state. And so that is where you get laws passed, where spending choices are made, where countries choose to favor this industry or that industry. And to that extent, you know, the focus on the oil and gas worker in the US would be the focus of that. However, you know, a country that's showing leadership and understanding this would be doing that in the context of global justice. And so when we ran the campaign for the Climate Change Act years ago, during Friends of the Earth days, this was a very live question. So at the time, and things have moved on very far since 2005, 6, 7, when we were debating this, but there was an argument about whether the UK should commit to a 60% cut by 2050 or an 80% cut by 2050. And the difference between the two was global justice. And in the end, you know, through a political debate here, 80% was adopted as the target. The science later refined that to a net zero by 2050. But the two things, they kind of came together. So it was a domestic platform for action, the Climate Change Act.
I didn't know that was.
That's what happened. And there were people in Parliament, in the House of Lords in particular, who were making that global justice case for the 80% cut. And they were drawing parallels with slavery and what happened in the early 19th century when the UK banned the slave trade, the first country to do this. And the arguments being used at the time to say, no, we've got to carry on with this because it's going to harm our competitiveness, and the French and the Spanish will take the sugar market. Yeah,
yes,
exactly. And so that was a very potent parallel to put into that conversation because it was a moral choice. You know, the science tells you one thing, but the morality and ethics of it tells you that you need to take responsibility for the wider set of issues, including the historical pollution. So that kind of led to the two things being conflated. So it was about justice for, you know, well, actually, not necessarily justice, but it was about taking responsibility in the UK. Whether it's a just transition for British oil and gas workers is a different matter. That's still work in progress. But the point being, in answer to that question, is that it was couched at the same time in that wider global situation.
And so on that note, should we be paying reparations, global north, west, whatever, to the countries that are really hit hard? And how do we, and if so, how do we sell that?
Well, we're not even paying for you know, a little bit of adaptation. I mean, the reparations question, it's an important debating point, but I think it is just a debating point, really. It's not going to take us anywhere. You know, the United Nations has set out what it will cost to adapt. This is not reparations. This is just a cost of adaptation. And it is in the order of $500 billion, 500 billion by 2030. And that's kind of round the corner. And what's been put on the table at the moment is less than 1% of that money is what's coming through the COP loss and damage process. So an interesting debating point, and probably morally, yes, but let's try and get in place the basics first in terms of enabling countries to be able to deal with what's coming. And we know what's coming. The sea's going up and the storms are getting more serious, and the aquifers are being contaminated with salt water, and the coral reefs are dying off, and the food supply is going to be impacted. And we're going to have to deal with that now as a matter of practical kind of humanitarian assistance, effectively. And, you know, should we pay for the damage being done in the past? Well, probably yes, we should.
But let's do this first.
Yeah, let's do that first.
And do you think will we?
Well, our aid budget has just been slashed back. I mean, the climate piece has been protected, as I understand the position, but you know, money is extremely tight, and so there's going to have to be some really creative ways of thinking about this, including how we can mobilize private sector investment into some of this. And you know, there is a business case for many organizations in terms of, like, you know, if you're dependent on tropical commodities and you're in a business that relies on that, you're going to need to be able to ensure there's resilience in your supply chain. And actually, I did mention in here the cocoa farmers in West Africa who I met in the field there a few years ago, and the extent to which their businesses are being destroyed, tiny, small rural businesses being destroyed by the effects of extreme heat and lack of rain. And that's a major issue for the likes of Mondelez and Nestle and all these people who rely on cocoa.
And that's where we're seeing some of the sort of global giant corporations
so they've got
take responsibility all the way through their supply chain, and they're not waiting for regulation.
No, they don't. We've run out of time for that. It's happening to them. Yeah. Well, I met people who are leaving and they're going, and some of them are going across the Sahara Desert to Libya, and they're getting on boats and they're coming to Europe. A whole other set of political issues there. And so how you stabilize their incomes and their livelihoods, including
why that is also selfishly good for
us. Exactly. Yes, exactly. There's security and migration issues.
And flipping that on its head a little bit. So you have you spoke to some indigenous leaders and you mentioned them in the book. I think the Amazon Headwaters Alliance,
various other,
Domingo and a few other. How do you? And I love the fact that more and more we're saying, oh, actually, there are peoples around the world who know how we should be together, be with nature, and ingrained in them is this sense. Yet it still feels to me like they get brought out at COP on stage. Everybody listens and is touched and is moved by the ceremonies of the dancing and the talk. But I'm not seeing collaboration in a real way that says, well, how do we learn? Are we just not humble enough, or what do you think that would take?
I don't think we're kind of used yet to being able to do that. And and the reason those voices are in there is because it's not only about economic inequality, it's also about inequality of voice.
Yes.
And you know, the fact that these peoples they used to run most of the earth, and their land was taken off of them in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Many of them were completely destroyed. Some of them have hung on. But they've hung on with a philosophy which is very different to the Western one.
Yeah.
It's nature-centric. They see their livelihoods and their identity as bound up with the natural world, unlike us in the West who sit in air-conditioned cars and get our food out of plastic bags. And so they retain a connection with how the earth works.
Yeah.
And so that wisdom, if it can get more of a voice, more political power, then that is going to be a material factor in putting us on a different course.
Yeah.
And so that's why their voice is so important, because it is a worldview which we've lost, which we did have once.
Yes.
And so can we bring that back to centre stage? And that's about equality in political representation and everything else. So that is an important thought, is how we can
how do we
bring that wisdom
in a real way, so it's not doesn't feel token. So
yeah, exactly. And actually what's striking about all of those people I spoke to is the extent to which they want to offer that as a solution to what they can see as a failing world. And they're very generous. Considering what happened to them 300, 400, 500 years ago, they're very
even talking to us.
Even talking to us, exactly. So that's so that was an important part of it. And you know what it comes in the story in here about the extent to which change on these big subjects is not going to come simply from repeating facts about how much carbon is in the atmosphere or how much rainforest is being cut down. It's going to have to come from much deeper places, including our collective worldview, which in the West is now shattered in terms of its understanding of what nature does. I mean, a few people get it, but the vast majority of us really don't. And so how we bring that wisdom back into the mainstream of how people think is going to be critical. Otherwise, we're just going to struggle to make the shifts that are needed.
No, and is that so? There's a lot of talk about, well, we just need a new narrative. You know, we need to tell better stories.
Yeah, it's a bit deeper than that.
But it feels a lot deeper than that to me.
Yeah, it is.
And something that almost seems overwhelming in a short period of time.
Yeah.
Unless, which I've heard suggested, unless we use the technology, unless we start advertising, I was going to say, and using the TikToks of this world for good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I do touch on this and the extent to which, you know, the worlds of advertising and marketing have created, in some large extent, the culture that we now live in.
Yes.
And so can you harness those tools with that wisdom to create a different culture? The answer, of course, is yes. But you need to kind of decide to do that first.
Do it with a vision in mind of a just world.
Yeah. And that actually is their offer. And, you know, what a lot of people are now saying is like, you know, can we combine these incredible technologies that we now have with that kind of understanding and worldview as being a big part of the solution to getting through the bottleneck we're now going into? And I think the answer is yes, we can do that.
I think it's the only way forward.
Yeah, we can do that. And so purpose-driven businesses that wish to have a positive role in shaping a more sustainable culture in the future, can they be using their marketing and advertising to be thinking about the opportunities they've got to be doing some of that? Kind of quite a radical thought.
It's very radical.
But nonetheless, it's quite a practical one, I think.
And what always brings me hope is actually I keep coming across people in business who think like this, who want to do it, who feel hamstrung somewhat by having to deliver certain results and whatever, but actually they are good people.
These people, they hear them talking about breaking things a lot, but they seem very slavishly attached to the old way of doing things for people who want to break stuff quickly.
Well, yes. Oh, I've seen more questions. Are there any countries showing global leadership?
No.
No, Rand is the answer. And there we go.
There's some are better than others. There's pockets of good practice in different parts of the world. I think actually, if you took good things that are being done in lots of different countries and put them all together, you probably could come up with you could come up with an imaginary country that would be leading. Yeah. So Ecuador, you know, it's given rights to nature.
Yes.
The Dutch are very good at cycling. Iceland's very good at geothermal. UK is getting good at offshore wind. Norway's very good at electric vehicles. Who's really good at sustainable food? You know, some of the tropical countries. So if you started putting all of these things together, you could paint a picture.
Learn from each other, maybe.
Yeah.
On that note, I should mention. So Rhiannon Jane Rafferty, she emailed in beforehand, thank you,
Yeah.
and said, do you think rivers having a legal status of living things will make it easier to protect them? So I think this is a reference to maybe the Canadian river, which
they've done that, and I think it was Ecuador, wasn't it, where nature had rights, and you know, these things, legal reframing. Of course, it's got huge potential, but it's a hugely political thing, of course. So if you wanted to do that, you would need to get it enacted by Parliament.
Yeah.
And I don't think our Parliament is ready for it. I just think, you know, and then it comes back to this worldview problem. Well, why would you give rivers rights? That's where we put the sewage, isn't it?
No, yes. Oh, God. Oh, I see another question for Brian. Ironically, speaking of COP, part of the Amazon forest is being felled to build a road for COP30.
Yeah, I saw that story. I don't know if it's true. I saw some other bits and pieces saying that they've been planning to build it for years and they just got round to it. It could be true. And, you know, but, you know, just kind of sums up the kind of mindset that we're in. I mean, if that is what they're doing, it's kind of, it's not really congruent with what the meeting's trying to do.
So there's something about, so it is about worldview. Really, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And one last question, because I'm realizing we've got to do a quick draw in a minute of the two books.
Very good.
I'm going to ask you to sign nicely.
Yeah.
Which is around, I guess it's around hope and around how we help give a hopeful worldview, especially to younger generations. Who right now, and I think particularly in the UK and Europe, are feeling quite rightly sort of hopeless.
Yeah, well, they need to get in the fight, I think. I think hope comes from from active engagement. I think trying to hand down some kind of view that it's all going to be fine because someone's going to invent something, which is often the way this is portrayed. That possibly doesn't help. I mean, if people really want to feel hopeful, I think they need to empower themselves and to get involved, really, and be part of the campaign for change.
Grassroots level?
Grassroots, every level. And actually in here, I invoke the idea of action at all levels, because that, I think, is going to be the necessary approach to solving this. It's not a technology. Technology is vital. It's not only going to be a campaign. Campaigning is vital. It's not only going to be a law. A law is vital. It's all of that, plus 100 other things that are going to have to happen as part of a global shift created by action at all levels. And one thing to bear in mind is the extent to which the world we live in now is the result of exactly such an effort put into motion back in the 1950s and 60s by the people who invented the free market global economy. They did it deliberately, and they did it by action at all levels. They got editorials in newspapers and changed public opinion. They got leading economists to write it down and produce models that went into journals to prove that it was right. They got politicians on side who were ideologically aligned with what they wanted to do. They got grassroots movements arguing for it. They got the businesses to line up and say they wanted it. And so we now need
it's a multi-level campaigning program, really.
A multi-level program, which includes campaigns, but also includes science, includes philosophical discussions and bringing in these voices of Indigenous people. And it will require cooperation across society, therefore. Artists, poets, scientists, chief executives, investors, to be able to get us onto a path that is broadly shifting the entire system, rather than trying to say, well, you know, well, let's do some more offshore wind. Essential though that is, it's not enough on its own.
No, and it won't. I actually reading your book made me go back to my Donella Meadows. And go, you know, different intervention points. For systemic change. And it's very much in line with that.
Good. Yes,
she's saying that it's brilliant if anybody hasn't read it. And there are some, you can Google it and you get an intervention program. And it's like, at the highest level, you have to change the paradigm, which is worldview, exactly what we're talking about. But it's scientific backup for yours.
Very good.
You didn't know about.
I'm delighted. Delighted to know that she was a great woman who did all this work long ago.
And no, it actually dovetails beautifully. Now, I have heard that one of my colleagues is going to draw two names out of a hat. I'm just looking if we're missing anything. Oh, whole society. Oh, so I'm being shown that we've got 2 winners.
Okay.
Shall I read them out? And
Yeah,
I've
got a pen in my pocket, I think.
In pocket.
Let's have a look.
So the first winner is somebody who has been to lots and lots of book club.
Okay.
And I think it's in Scotland. So Ran, you have been your name's just been drawn out of a hat. I hope you haven't bought the book yet. Yay! Yeah. Exactly.
I signed this for Ran. Ran, would you like to put your name there?
Yes, good. I'm seeing a thumbs up. And the second person is Brad Pierce. Yes, there you go, with the forest behind you, ish. Wonderful. Congratulations. If anybody else,
Ran.
There we go.
And Brad.
Yes.
Okay.
If anybody else is very keen on a signed copy, we know that Tony's signing books here at Eden, so I'm very happy to figure out if we can.
Yeah, we can do that.
We can get some sent. Yeah. They won't be all on our account if everybody wants one, but close. So hopefully that is good. We're now at 3 minutes to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
We're about to, I think, there's a session going on.
What's it all about?
It's about reverse mentoring.
Okay.
Generational mentoring, because there's a lot of emerging leaders here.
Okay.
So that would be quite an interesting one.
Would.
But I think it's next to the pop-up pub.
Okay.
At the Eden Project. Good. So I'm going to drag you along to that.
Thank you. Okay. That's good.
Thank you, everyone. What we sometimes do, which I'll encourage, is that everybody just unmutes and maybe says goodbye in whatever language they feel comfortable saying goodbye in, and we will say goodbye from here. Thank you.